The Sea by Frederick Whymper, published in 1883, started its story about the Samaritano as follows. Quote, "One Sunday night in the month of February, a few years ago, the weather was what sailors call dirty, and accompanied by sudden gusts of wind and snow-squalls. Before light broke on Monday morning, the Margate lugger Eclipse put out to sea to cruise round the shoals and sands in the neighborhood of Margate, on the lookout for victims of any disasters that might have occurred during the night. And the crew soon discovered that a vessel was ashore on the Margate sands."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Rescue of the Samaritano?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Samaritano was a small 170-ton wooden brig from Spain. She was sailing from Antwerp to Santander with a general cargo under the command of Captain Modesto Crespo and a crew of 11. In the fury of the storm, in the early hours of February 20th, 1860, the ship had found herself in danger. In the face of the wind and the snow, she had been forced onto the Margate sands at 5:30 in the morning. The crew of the Samaritano had attempted to launch their ship's boats and reach safety, but in the poor weather, they had failed to do so. All of the boats on board the ship were stove in, and their oars were broken by the pounding waves, forcing the crew to hunker down and wait for assistance. Assistance was fortunately not too far away. The Eclipse, on seeing the Samaritano and heading her direction, encountered a Whitstable smack along the way. From her, they were able to borrow 2 of the smack's crew, as well as her boat. In this, they reached the Samaritano. For now, this was an attempted salvage operation, with the crew of the Eclipse hoping that high tide could float the Samaritano off. 6 of the Margate crew and the 2 men from the Whitstable remained on the ship to assist in trying to free the ship when the tide did rise. They were to be disappointed, and soon they were in grave danger. With the incoming tide also came the storm, renewing its force. The sea was now lifting the Samaritano up and then dropping her back down on the sand, causing her to shudder. A hole was soon knocked in her side, and the waves were now sweeping the ship's deck. Some of these waves snatched the boat that the would-be rescuers had arrived in, smashed it to pieces, and then carried it over the side. The men from Margate and Whitstable were now trapped on the Samaritano, just as the original crew had been. The hatches of the ship were soon battered in by the sea, and the cargo began to float away and be washed overboard. But no one had time to care about that. The waves crashing over the ship with force were making it very likely that soon the ship would be knocked broadside, which would spell the end for the men on board. In order to mitigate this danger, they chopped down the mainmast, and once this was over, the 19 men climbed into the foremast rigging for safety. It would prevent them from being washed away so long as the mast held, but it would not do anything to shelter them from the elements. Snow and sleet was falling on them. The winds were whipping around them, and the sea spray was drenching them as they held on and hoped that help was on the way. Fortunately for the people clinging to the rigging, the people on shore were well aware of their plight, and people were climbing to the top of the cliff with spyglasses in the hopes of being able to see the wrecked ship through the storm. In the meantime, the smaller of the Margate lifeboats set out on a rescue mission. Unfortunately, in their rush to set out, the crew forgot to close the valves for the air boxes of the lifeboat, turning the boat from a dependable lifeboat into a regular boat that was quickly filling with water. They still managed to get within a quarter of a mile from the Samaritano, but by that time, the boat was becoming unmanageable, and they were forced to turn back to shore. It took the boat 4 hours of fighting the storm before they were able to safely land at Westgate Bay, where the Coast Guard was waiting to assist them and render aid to the would-be rescuers. With the smaller lifeboat having failed, the larger lifeboat, the Friend of All Nations, was now launched, but this boat was also overpowered by the storm. The Friend of All Nations soon had her tiller broken, and she was driven ashore about a mile from where she had launched. With both lifeboats now out of commission, 2 luggers now made the attempt. The Nelson was soon fighting for her own safety. Her foremast was ripped from her almost as soon as she had departed from the pier, and her crew had to fight to keep her off the rocks. The Lively fared better, but she was still not able to reach the wreck of the Samaritano. In the face of this, the Coast Guard lieutenant sent a message to Ramsgate asking for them to send their steamer and lifeboat. In Margate, this was considered a desperate hope, since the people from Ramsgate would have an even more dangerous journey to the wreck of the Samaritano than they had had. But it was still hope, and better than standing on the shore and watching until the people in the rigging succumbed to the cold or exhaustion. The people of Ramsgate, much like the people of Margate, had been worried about the possibility of a wreck due to the storm. Ramsgate had heard at 9 a.m. that there was a wreck near Margate, but had reasonably thought that the Margate life-saving crew would take care of the rescue. Still, they were worried about other wrecks taking place closer to home, and the harbor's steam tug, the Aid, had its steam up all night in case it needed to leave in a hurry. It therefore did not take much time for the men from Ramsgate to depart when they got news that both of the lifeboats from Margate had been defeated, and their help was needed. There was a rush to man the lifeboat, and it was taken in tow by the Aid. They were in for a 12-mile fight against the gale before they could reach the Samaritano. The crew of 13 on the lifeboat departed from Ramsgate at 12:30 in the afternoon, but they would not see the wreck until 4 p.m., and it would be even longer before they reached her. The advantage that they had over the Margate men was the steam tug, which was forced to have its engines working at full power in order to win against the force of the storm. In the meantime, the men in the lifeboat held onto the boat tightly as the waves battered them. Up to their knees in water, and with their mittens freezing in their hands, as they passed through the end of the Cud Channel, they very nearly lost their steam advantage. A wave smashed over both steamship and lifeboat with such force that the rope parted from the tension, and even though the men in the lifeboat began to row immediately, they were in danger of striking the broke shoal. Fortunately, the Aid turned back quickly and threw them a new rope, towing the lifeboat back to safety. By afternoon, the storm had gotten so bad that the people in the lifeboat could no longer see the Aid, even though she was only 100 yards ahead of them. The line did not break again, however, and as they rounded the North Foreland, the storm abated some, and they were able to see Margate. Initially, the crew of the lifeboat could see the various rescue ships that had been wrecked or damaged, but they could not see the wreck on the sands, since the storm was still covering it. The storm cleared further soon, though, and they were able to see the Samaritano, her distress signal still flying. The initial plan was for the lifeboat to make its way across the sands, since even though this was going to be dangerous and back-breaking work, it would also be the fastest way. They even tossed off the tow rope with this in mind. Unfortunately, the tide was not in their favor, and they realized that they would have to be towed at least 3 miles to the east before they could be sufficiently windward of the wreck to reach her. This led to a further delay as they fought to reconnect the tossed-off tow rope, but they did eventually manage it. The storm had only had a lull, and now it was in full fury again, if not even more fierce than before. They only caught occasional glimpses of the wreck now and again, even though they were anxiously looking for it, afraid that it would break up before they could reach it, or that they would reach it and find that the entire crew had already been washed away. For 20 minutes, the lifeboat was under tow by the aid before the tow rope parted under the strain again, and this time there was no thought of reconnecting it. The lifeboat crew lifted their sail. There was no option of using the oars. The waves were crashing over the boat still with such force that the crew of the boat had to hold on, and were not able to do anything else or they would be swept away. Standing a little way away from the wreck of the Samaritano was the Margate lugger the Eclipse that had first found the wreck, and, as the lifeboat passed her, they shouted to the lifeboatmen that 8 of their men were on board of the wreck. The Eclipse was not able to get close, but they also were not willing to abandon the men who were trapped on the ship, so they had stood at anchor ever since the men had become trapped on the Samaritano, in the hope of being able to render some sort of aid. By now, the Samaritano's stern was settled down and only her starboard bow was still visible above the waves. As the lifeboat drew near, they could see that the rigging of the foremast was still full of men though. In spite of the many delays, they were not too late. The lifeboat was forced to anchor about 40 yards from the wreck, and then slowly play out the cable until they came alongside, since the wreckage of the mainmast prevented them from stationing themselves in the lee of the wreck, which would have allowed for a safer approach. As soon as the lifeboat came alongside of the wreck, 3 of the men in the rigging jumped down and were pulled into the lifeboat. These 3 must have been the strongest out of the group, since they were able to save themselves, even after 8 hours of clinging to the rigging in the storm. It would be more difficult to save the others, who needed help to get down. They were barely able to hold on with their frost-bitten hands. It was estimated that even if another half-hour had passed, at least some lives would have been lost. An oncoming wave forced the men in the lifeboat to haul on the cable and draw their boat away from the wreck in the next moment, or they would have been smashed against the side of the Samaritano. The next time they were able to get alongside the Samaritano, they were able to attach lifelines to the mast, which helped another 13 men unlash themselves, come down from the rigging, and enter the boat. Once these 13 had been saved, the boat was forced to pull away using the cable again until another large wave had passed. The final 3 people in the rigging were all members of the crew of the Samaritano. They were too weak to unlash themselves from the rigging and come down on their own, and the crew of the lifeboat was forced to come dangerously close to the ship so that members of their crew could climb on board the Samaritano. Once on the wreck, the 2 grown men were able to be lifted down into the boat until only the cabin boy remained. The cabin boy was entangled in the rigging, and so too was the canvas bag that he had been stubbornly holding on to throughout the 8 hours, full of souvenirs for his family. His refusal to let go of the bag meant that one of the men from the lifeboat had to climb up and pull the boy from the rigging and into the boat, bag and all. The delay prevented the boat from pulling itself away on time, as another wave struck them. The boat was lifted into the rigging that the survivors had been clinging to, but they were lucky enough not to become entangled. The boat once again landed in the sea on an even keel, and they were able to depart the wreck of the Samaritano. The crew of the lifeboat was in the middle of cutting the anchor cable so they could depart when the wind struck them hard enough to blow the mast from their boat. If they had already parted the cable, they would have been smashed into the Samaritano. But, fortunately, the partially cut cable held, and they were able to drag the mast back into their boat and re-rig it. With this, the lifeboat was able to return to the aid. The men who had survived the wreck had to be held up in the deck of the aid, and one man was so weak that he had to be tied to a rope and pulled up. But they had succeeded in saving everyone who had been on board the Samaritano. The aid was able to turn back for Ramsgate. In Ramsgate, the crew of the Samaritano were met with great hospitality, and they could only express their gratitude for the work of their rescuers. Captain Crespo admitted that he had thought that all of their lives were lost, and that they were only prolonging the inevitable. Out of gratitude, he had a picture made of the rescue of himself and his men so that he could show the Spanish authorities. The rescuers were rewarded for their efforts. The English Board of Control issued £2 and a medal for each of the rescuers, while the Spanish government issued £3 and a medal. No one could ignore that it was a wonder that not only those who had been shipwrecked, but also the lifesavers had all set foot safely on shore after they had fought with such a terrible storm.
For more information, please see the lifeboat from July 2nd, 1860, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.